Hello folks, welcome back to World War II TV and a week of just random shows that don't really fall into a particular theme, although as you know this year I have been trying to schedule events that fall on the exact anniversaries, and such is the case with this one in that 77 years ago today and tomorrow Operation Varsity, the crossing of the Rhine, was occurring, and it was the last big push into Germany to end the war. So my guest is a second-time visitor to World War II TV. He was on 9 or 10 months ago talking about the 17th Airborne's kind of role in the operation, but this time he's kind of gone sideways with his presentation. He's going to talk particularly about the glider aspect of Operation Varsity, American and British. He is the author of this book, which I'm holding up here, 4 Hours of Fury, which is predominantly about the 17th Airborne, but he's going to expand and talk a little bit about the British 6th Airborne Division. And as we've talked about a lot on this channel, it seems that once you get after the Ardennes offensive in December 44, January 45, people kind of press fast forward on their history and want to get to VE Day. And a lot of the incredible fighting that occurred sort of March, April 45 seems to get overlooked. Peter Caddick Adams is doing his new book. He's going to be on that period there. And, there's always that worry about, will readers be interested in that period because everything is D-Day, everything is Battle of the Bulge. But for my money, that March, April period is really, really interesting. Yes, the end of the war in terms of the result is kind of definite now. The Germans are going to lose, but there's still lots more fighting to be done. And the crossing of the Rhine is a major hurdle that has to be achieved. So if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to click subscribe. Don't forget to like the shows you're watching. Leave comments during the show in the live chat and afterwards as well. And as always, all the links you will need are in the description below. The link to buying James's book, the link to James' website, the link to other resources are all there below. So don't forget to go expand that view on YouTube and find all those resources there. But I'm now going to introduce my guest. James Fenelon is a former paratrooper turned author, and he's turned his attention to the crossing of the Rhine. So good afternoon, James. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Paul. How are you?
I'm good. So you heard my little ramble there. That March, April period probably doesn't get as much attention compared to D-Day, compared to Market Garden. My crossing of the Rhine bookshelf isn't a bookshelf. It's 2 or 3 books on a shelf of other things, and I guess yours is similar. I mean, we talked about this on the first show. You're kind of where, if you're doing a book about D-Day paratroops, you're one of many people. Crossing of the Rhine doesn't get the attention. So if people who didn't see that first show, why do you think what was ostensibly the most successful airborne operation probably of World War II, why does it not get enough attention?
Absolutely. Well, I think you've nailed it, Paul. I mean, it's, one of the statistics I found pretty interesting when I was doing research for it was, if you look at April of 1945, which was the last full month of the war, on the American side at least, there were 10,000 killed in action in April of 1945, which was essentially the exact same number almost as the Americans suffered in June of 1944. And so, to your point, we kind of have this view that, as you study the war, you obviously understand that the Germans weren't producing as much material as they had at the early part of the war. The training and quality of their soldiers and pilots wasn't nearly as high as it was at the beginning of the war. And so I think there's a false assumption that the war just kind of petered out at the end, and May 8th came along and the war was over. But the reality is to your point, there was tremendous fighting all the way up to and including that very last part of the war. And so I think it's just kind of been overlooked.
It's the wounded animal, isn't it? An animal, a dangerous animal, is never more when it's wounded. And the Third Reich was wounded to the point of it was just awaiting that death blow. But they're fighting for their homeland now. The Rhine is a big symbolic barrier as well as a physical barrier. We know that even at this late stage, Goebbels' propaganda is still working very, very well within Germany. The Volkssturm, the Hitler Youth, the determination to and not just from the West, of course, the Russians are coming in from the East. So it's all hands on the pump at this point now to desperately hold on. So it is an era that needs more examination, I think. But anyway, let's leap in and get on with the presentation. And unless you want to make another point in my introduction there. Sorry.
The only other point I was going to make that complements what you were saying is it's also, as that the West and the East were coming together as the Soviets and the Allies were, or the Americans and British were coming in from the West. It also significantly reduced the German supply lines.
Yeah.
Right. So they had a much better ability to actually respond because they had less distance to move their guns and what resources they did have around. That was
very good point. So you've come with your expertly, graphically superior PowerPoint presentation that I'll be controlling today. And you said before you went live, your focus in your writing has been the American side of things. So you're tackling the British side for us as well. But we welcome questions, we welcome comments from the viewers there, and an operation of this enormity. Neither I nor James will know every minute detail of it because it is enormous, and so we're going to go through ostensibly the glider aspect of it today, which of an overlooked operation is probably the overlooked part of the overlooked operation. But just since you were last on, your book's been out a couple of years now. Have you had more archives open up to you? Have people been in touch with you since the book came out, pointing you in the direction of other accounts and other resources?
Yes and no. I mean, it's interesting just because of the pandemic. None of the archives have really been available. Unfortunately, that's starting to change currently. I have been very fortunate to have been contacted by numerous veterans and their family, which is always frankly, probably the most rewarding aspect of writing a book like this is hearing from families that now understand, what their dad or their grandfather did during the war, or at least having a better insight, into what that experience might have been like, because some of them were so reticent to actually talk about it. So that's been definitely an aspect of the process that I've really enjoyed. Yes.
Super. Well, I say we'll do some questions as we go along if they're pertinent to what we're talking about. Any kind of big ones about kind of the final chapter of the war, we can kind of do that at the end there. But I'll hand over to you, and folks, as you know the score. Fire away with your comments, and we'll have a good history lesson. So over to you, James.
Yeah, so we're gonna, as Paul mentioned, we're gonna talk about the gliders, and I think it's a valid point that of the operation, the gliders are the most overlooked aspect of the overlooked operation, so to speak. But really, one of the things that I learned as I was kind of peeling the layers apart on all this is they actually had the most vital role of Operation Varsity, and I think as we get into our conversation today, you'll see why, right? I think some of the criticisms that have been leveled against Varsity was that it didn't really appreciably deepen the bridgehead when you compare it to the rest of the river crossing across the Rhine. And so we're going to get into what exactly the roles of the gliders and the glider pilots had as part of Operation Varsity. So for us to do that, let's go to the next slide. And just very briefly, I'm going to give a very oversimplified view of what was going on in the fall of 1945 and fall of 1944 and the spring of 1945, so that everybody kind of has an understanding of where Varsity fit into that campaign. Basically, as you all probably know, the Allies landed in France in June of 1944, started pushing their way east across Europe. And again, is just a very high level oversimplified. The American forces were largely in that southern or right flank corridor as they pushed across. The British, Canadian, and French forces were to their north on the left shoulder. And that campaign largely went according to plan until December of 1944, when the Germans launched, their counterattack out of the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. It wasn't until mid to late January that the Allies regained and pushed regained that terrain that they had lost, which took them up to getting closer to the Rhine and into Germany in mid-February, so to speak. Now, as the Allied armies were pushing their way across France, one of the things that was identified that needed to happen was the creation of one of the most kind of unique commands within the Supreme Headquarters, which was the 1st Allied Airborne Army. And so if we go to the next slide, and what made this command unique within Supreme Headquarters was that it was a combined command, meaning that even though it was commanded by an American general, who we'll talk about in a minute, his second in command was a British general, initially General Browning, who you may know from A Bridge Too Far, the famous quote, I think we've gone a bridge too far. And the Allied Airborne Army was really a coordinating body. It was not intended to fight ground campaigns. It was first responsible for the management, refitting, and equipping of the airborne divisions. But it also had a pretty unique role in that its primary job was to anticipate the needs of ground commanders as they pushed east into across Europe, and identify points where ground commanders might actually need to employ airborne troops, and then develop the plans for those operations, right? So if you take an example of, say, Montgomery or Patton, and you're pushing your way east, what you don't want to do is you don't want to pause the momentum of your ground campaign while the airborne forces get to their airfields, take 2 or 3 weeks to plan all their air routes, plan where their drop zones are going to be. By that time, the Germans have reinforced their front. You've lost the momentum. And so what was happening is that the Allied planning just, the airborne troops couldn't keep up with how fast the ground campaign was moving. So in June of 1944, Eisenhower approved the creation of the first Allied Airborne Army. It came into being shortly thereafter, maybe like July of 1944, again, and immediately started building out this portfolio, if you will, of plans that they kept in a filing cabinet, right? And so this idea was like Market Garden is a perfect example of that. That was based on a pre-existing plan. They pulled it out of the file cabinet, dusted it off, and updated the landing zones, the drop zones, and some of the air routes based on this kernel of a plan that had already existed. Now, as part of that, what also made this unique is that you had within the Allied Airborne Army the 18th Airborne Corps, which was the American Corps, which oversaw the 4 airborne divisions and a handful of regimental combat teams that were independent airborne units. Then you also had the 1st British Airborne Corps, which oversaw the 2 British divisions, the Polish Brigade and the SAS. And these were more of your traditional field corps, right? The idea was that these corps were responsible for the administration of these divisions during the airborne operation. And we'll talk a little bit more about the nuances of that as we get into the actual planning. And then also folded into this army were the troop carrier units that contained the gliders and the troop carrier aircraft to actually deliver and transport these airborne units, right? Now, the one small exception to that is the dotted line you'll see here above the RAF number 38 and 46 groups. The RAF did not want to give up control of those groups, and so they were dotted line to the Airborne Army and were loaned to them, if you will, during operations. But the RAF maintained operational control of those units on a day-to-day basis.
And just to quickly reference the fact, because we had James Daly on our show a few months ago talking about, I think it was 27 operations that were cancelled between Overlord and Market Garden. And as you said there, the issue is that by the time the plan has been put together, the situation has changed on the ground. So the plan is now out of date. So it's a bit like chess, isn't it? The airborne thinkers are now trying to get to the point where they're 2 or 3 moves ahead in their minds of where the group troops are on the ground, so that when the situation arises, they can, as you say, kind of having preempted what they might need, they can pull kind of a skeleton plan out of somewhere and then work on that. It's basically taking the 5 years of airborne operations of all sides, because we've covered them all, not all of them. We've done Operation Mercury, the German jump into Crete. We've done the Russian jumps into Vyazma. We've done British jumps, American jumps. Some have gone really well. Some have gone not so well. But theoretically, by this point of the war, the Allies, with their resources, should be able to put together a plan that is sound. We should be able to look back on that 5 years and say, here's how to do it. Here's not how to do it.
Absolutely right. And I think a lot of those lessons learned were captured in the expertise that we found within the Allied Airborne Army. And we'll talk about one of those guys who was very much an expert. A couple of guys were really much an expert. But before we get to the experts, let's go to the next slide and talk about the not so much of an expert. So the commander of the first Allied Airborne Army was a guy by the name of Louis Brereton. Some of you who have studied the war extensively may recognize the name. He, at the beginning of when the Americans entered the war in December 1941, he was the commander of MacArthur's B-17 units in the Philippines. He kind of infamously got caught with his bombers on the ground in the Philippines. Almost all of the B-17s were destroyed in a surprise attack by the Japanese, which removed the ability for the U.S. and MacArthur to launch a surprise attack back on Formosa. At the time was a potential landing point. So he left the Pacific Theater shortly after that and arrived in Europe in 1942 as commander of the 9th Air Force, where he again struggled as a commander. He seemed to have a penchant for fighters and bombers. And at that point, one of his responsibilities as commander of the 9th Air Force was to ensure that the troop carrier pilots were up to speed as far as their ability to deliver gliders and paratroopers on target. And so he was kind of brought to task, if you will, for lack of a better term, after the airborne operation in Sicily, which was a near disaster with that nighttime drop that was wildly misdropped. He, at that point, was supposed to invest heavily in the navigation capabilities of the troop carrier pilots. I don't think it surprises anybody who's probably watching this that he again failed to execute that duty and was again called to task after the misdrops in Normandy. And it was at that point, as I mentioned, that they started to, Eisenhower started to approve the creation of this first Allied Airborne Army. So it's a little bit of a mystery as to why you would take somebody who had repeatedly demonstrated an unwillingness to work with troop carriers and then put that general in charge of the command who was overall responsible for it. Omar Bradley referred to Brereton as marginally competent. And Brereton himself always liked to refer to himself in the third person. So he's definitely kind of an interesting character. And when I was putting this presentation together, I kind of had to laugh that this was his portrait that I found at the Smithsonian Institute, because in his diary, when he was assigned to command this, he very much wrote almost word for word that he viewed this as a demotion. And so it's kind of ironic to me that his portrait actually has gliders and parachutes in the background of it when he very clearly was not thrilled with this assignment. But again, I have to, and I'm going into the realm of speculation here a little bit, but I have to suspect that the Eisenhower and Bradley and some of these commanders viewed that they were marginalizing him by putting him largely in charge of an administrative area, because it was the corps commanders and the commanders of those troop carrier groups, both in the RAF and in the Air Force, the Air Corps, that were responsible for those units, right? So we'll see, though, how they kind of underestimated Brereton's ability to stick his fingers in other people's business as we continue on. But he was in charge at the time that Montgomery started getting closer to the Rhine. And so if we go to the next slide, as we mentioned previously, the Allies are pushing their way closer to the Rhine in the spring of 1945. 21 Army Group is responsible largely for that sector in the northern area of the Rhine. Montgomery launches two operations in February of 1945, Operation Grenade and Operation Veritable. The object of those two missions was to basically push the Germans to the far side of the Rhine. So you kind of had this nice front, if you will, along the river of the Rhine there, keeping in mind that the Rhine River averages around 400 yards in width. So it is a pretty formidable water obstacle. And it was as part of this closing exercise, if you will, of pushing the Germans across the Rhine River in anticipation of what was going to come next, that Montgomery requested 3 airborne divisions from Brereton, right, from the 1st Allied Airborne Army. He wanted 3 divisions to drop just on the other side of Vessel there. And it's worth pointing out before we kind of go on that the Supreme Headquarters, the combined chiefs really looked at Montgomery as the primary effort to cross into Germany. Right, the Americans down there in the bottom corner of the map did seize a bridge at Remagen and took advantage of that and started crossing into Germany. But the Allied plan has always been to cross further up, where the terrain was more conducive to sweeping campaigns, And the goal was to encircle the Ruhr, which is where Germany's industrial area is further up north there. By encircling that area, you could cut off their industrial capability to supply their armies in the field. The terrain opposite Remagen is really hilly and not very conducive to the kind of the breakout and the speed of the campaign that the Allies wanted to execute at this point.
And it's just worth mentioning, James, I think, because some Americans, I think, have forgotten this, that Montgomery's stock was quite high in March 45, wasn't he? But if you're only talking about airborne operations, if people only know of his most recent thing as being Market Garden, you can't imagine his stock being much lower. But Veritable has been, okay, it wasn't a sweeping success, but it was methodically plodding its way and reached its objectives. But he definitely come out of the Ardennes offensive very well. I mean, we did a show with General Bolger about the armored units in the Bulge, and an American general saying how much he admired Montgomery's participation in the Ardennes offensive. So if you only look you could go from Market Garden to the Rhine, people would question why he's where he is. But as I say, his stock is high again, isn't it? He's done what he's had to do pretty well. So I just wanted to make that point for Americans watching this, thinking, why the hell would Montgomery be given anything to do with airborne again? Well, because he's earned that right, I think.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's a point worth bringing out, and I think it's also important for us to kind of separate our personal feelings about somebody versus our professional feelings about somebody, right? And I think that when you kind of dig into, especially the American period opinions, we'll talk a little about Ridgway. Ridgway did not necessarily like Montgomery, but you don't ever really see a lot of heavy criticism of his professional ability, right? So there's a difference there. And I think that sometimes gets lost because it's easy to kind of grasp onto the personalities. But to your point, his stock was high. And, and I think, again, Varsity, as we'll talk about, was extremely successful. And so it's this idea of, Montgomery's almost damned if he does and damned if he doesn't type of thing, right? He has an aggressive plan for Market Garden. It doesn't work out the way everybody wants it to, but then he also gets criticized for not being aggressive enough. So it's kind of like you gotta pick your poison. But he had a very aggressive plan for this with 3 divisions. And so if you go to the next slide, Brereton put in charge of Operation Varsity, the 1st Airborne Corps commanded by Richard Gale. Now, Richard Gale, as probably many of you know, was originally the 6th Airborne Division commander in Normandy. He was an extremely experienced airborne commander. After he was rotated out of commanding the 6th Airborne, he went to the planning staff, some of the planning staffs that I mentioned, and became very familiar with combined air operations and was very much familiar with how large-scale airborne operations were going to unfold. Now, he and Brereton agreed that because Varsity was going to largely be a British operation supporting 21 Army Group, that it made sense for the British 1st Airborne Corps to coordinate and manage that aspect of it. Gale's kind of one of my favorite personalities. His nickname was Windy. I would love to had a beer with him at some point. He just seems like a real interesting character. He was a platoon leader in the First World War of a machine gun platoon. I can't think of anything more horrific than that experience must have been. And I suspect it probably is what made an airborne position attractive to him, right? If you compare, there's very little to compare between being stuck in the mud with a machine gun platoon and swooping in gliders and taking advantage of vertically enveloping your enemy. And so I think he saw, how progress was moving his ability forward to engage the enemy. And I think he enjoyed that aspect of airborne warfare.
And just to jump in, to me, he's the best user of gliders. If you look at, as a D-Day guy, if you look at the 101st, the 82nd, the 6th, the air landing aspect of the 6th operation is where its genius lay. Everyone focuses on Merville Battery and Pegasus Bridge because they are the 2 exciting events. But actually, the deployment of all those reserves that came in and the gliders with the tanks and the medical facility units, all that, which a lot of that was Gale's influence there, was what really made the 6th Airborne shine in Normandy. And I don't think either Ridgway and Gavin or Taylor had quite that mastery of the glider aspect in Normandy. That's just my little take on the subject there. Gale has that, as you say, that combined ops kind of approach to airborne warfare, is using all your resources, not just the elan of the paratroopers.
That's right. That's right. And I think you're going to see how that tradition carried on with the 6th Airborne when we get into Varsity for sure. So Gale proceeds to start the planning phase of Operation Varsity. Word gets to Montgomery that 1st Airborne Corps is planning and that Gale is in charge of that. And Montgomery immediately calls Brereton and tells Brereton that he doesn't want Richard Gale in charge of it, that he wants the gentleman on our next slide to be in command of Operation Varsity, which is Matthew Ridgway. Brereton tells him, no, you're going to get the 1st Airborne Corps, and Richard Gale will be planning your operation. Now, the reason Montgomery didn't want to work with 1st Airborne Corps was because he had more confidence, at least this was his stated reason, in 18th Airborne Corps' communication capability, right? So he felt a little bit burned by 1st Airborne's communication problems that they had during Operation Market Garden, and that was certainly one of the contributing factors towards some of the problems that happened in that operation. And so Montgomery really wanted to avoid a repeat of that and was adamant that Ridgway's 18th Airborne Corps be in command of Varsity. Now, Montgomery and Brereton couldn't agree to terms on this, so it was pushed up the chain of command, if you will, and to Eisenhower. And again, going back to that comment I made earlier about 21 Army Group being the main effort to cross the Rhine, Eisenhower sided with Montgomery, told Brereton to go back, tap Ridgway, get him ready to go for Operation Varsity. So Brereton is pretty upset about this, but communicates to Ridgway. Now, Ridgway at this time and the 18th Airborne Corps staff are actually fighting at the front under the command of Omar Bradley. And General Ridgway is really enjoying the challenges, the leadership challenges of being a Corps commander on an active front commanding ground divisions. And so he doesn't want to go to command Operation Varsity. Now, part of the reason for that is, and you'll continue to see this as we talk about this, but there's not a lot for an Airborne Corps commander to do during the operation, right? The Corps commander an Airborne Corps commander has a lot to do with the planning of the operation, getting all the pieces moving. Once the divisions actually get on the ground, just because of the nature of an airborne operation, it's up to small unit commanders, company commanders, battalion commanders to execute the mission and seize their objectives. Once the objectives are seized, depending on the relationship with the ground forces that are linking up with the airborne units, once that link up occurs, command of the airborne units go to the ground commander. So, you know, you could appreciate perhaps Ridgway's view of that he's actively engaged in combat. He really enjoys, you know, probably the wrong word, but he is relishing that experience, and he wrote about it, you know, very enthusiastic in his memoirs, that he felt that, you know, he was the man for the job in that scene. He protested to Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley protested to Eisenhower. Eisenhower again sided with Montgomery, went back down the chain. Ridgway picks up all his bags and his staff and moves out to go plan Operation Varsity, albeit begrudgingly. Now, so he meets with General Gale, finds out that they are two very much like-minded, and that a lot of the effort that Gale has already put into the planning for Operation Varsity is sound. So Ridgway, for lack of a better word, deputizes Richard Gale and makes him his second in command for the operation. And so while Ridgway is in the process of extracting his staff from the front, having another corps take over his mission, Gale continues to do the planning for the operation. And so if you go to the next slide, and these kind of build on each other here, but this is kind of the area of operations for Operation Varsity, right across the Rhine River there, on the outskirts of Wesel. And as you can see on the map, The area of operations is bordered by the Issel Canal on the southeast, and then the Issel River to the northeast, so to speak. And these bridges are really the crux of the mission, the operation, and why we want to talk about the gliders today, right? Because it was seizing these bridges that was really the primary objective of Operation Varsity. So if you go one more slide. The Americans in their sector had 10 bridges, and they numbered them 1 through 10, starting counterclockwise down there at the bottom. And the British had 3 bridges in their sector that they alphabetized X, Y, and Z, or Z, I guess, as in the Queen's English.
Yep.
And so it was these bridges that became the critical objective. And so, and the reason for that was twofold. First, the Germans had their armored reserve on the far side of the Issel River, right? So imagine you're the Germans on the far side of the Rhine River. It's obvious that the Allies are going to have to cross the Rhine. At some point, you have limited armored reserves because, again, as we spoke about at the top of the show, the Germans absolutely had far less resources and material than they did at the beginning of the war. So you have to guard those very judiciously, right? So the German plan was, okay, we're going to hold our armored reserves in the rear. Once we identify what Montgomery's primary axis of advance is, only then would we commit these armored reserves. So the way they were going to commit their armored reserves into the river crossing would be across these bridges. And so Gale, Ridgway, Montgomery, Dempsey all knew that these bridges were important for that aspect. And so these bridges were all assigned to glider units to seize them quickly and to seize them intact. Now, the reason they wanted to seize them intact was because the eventual plan was to then use these bridges for the Allied breakout of this bridgehead once the Rhine crossing was completed. And so metaphorically, you have an operation that's very similar to Normandy, right? You're dropping airborne troops on the flanks to seize objectives to prevent the Germans from coming in on the beachhead in Normandy and on the bridgehead here on the Rhine River. So it's, from a strategic standpoint, it's employing airborne forces in a very similar style.
And it makes sense to go back to something that had worked rather than doing something market garden wise, where it all depended on the total success, all hinged on the first bit going okay. In this kind of plan, even if you don't get all the bridges, you've still achieved 80-90% of what you need to do. Whereas the market garden plan was a bit kind of putting all your money on a 6 on the roulette table kind of thing, wasn't it? Whereas if the first bit doesn't work, the last bit's definitely not going to work. So you can see there's a bit of kind of reverting to something that is somewhere between being risky and also a safe bet. It's kind of a comfortable risk assessment. This, I mean, that's how I always feel about Varsity. It's and we're at the point of the war where we don't have to take absolutely crazy bold risks now. It's kind of calculated risks with an eye on keeping casualties to a minimum. That's right.
So if we advance one more, this kind of shows the layout of the drop zones and landing zones. The northern sector there was where the British 6th Airborne was going to land. The bottom sector where the 17th Airborne Division was going to land. When Ridgway took over planning of the operation, one of the things that did get changed was Montgomery's use of 3 divisions. So one of Brereton's concerns was, of course, as managing those airborne divisions. The other thing to keep in mind is remembering that at the time, the 1st British Airborne Division was refitting after Arnhem, right? They came out of that badly mauled, so they weren't really deployable. British 6th Airborne Division had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and in February made their way back to England to refit. The 17th Airborne, 82nd, and 101st, all 3 of them had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and again, oversimplified numbers here, but basically all had suffered about 4,000 casualties each. And then you had the 13th Airborne Division, the American 13th Airborne Division, which had just landed in France and was in the process of getting equipped and getting up to speed, and would go on to, I think, be the only American division that landed in Europe that did not see combat. But Ridgway, looking at the plan, didn't see a justification for 3rd Division. So the 13th Airborne Division was taken out of the plan, and the mission was allocated towards the 6th and 17th Airborne Division. Now, going forward, one of the things that allowed them to pull off this plan of having this number of drop zones and landing zones was the number of aircraft. And so if we look at the next slide, just for visual reference, one of the things that the Allies had at this time was a lot of aircraft. And so they had, for the first time in the war, the ability to simultaneously lift 2 divisions. And there were a couple of benefits, or a couple of things that they had going in their favor that helped them with that. One was the size of the British gliders was almost twice as big as the passenger glider that the United States used. So it allowed them to carry a full platoon at a time. The Americans adopted double tow. So if you look at this picture in the top left, what that meant was one C-47 was able to actually tow in 2 of the American Waco gliders. And then also arriving in the European theater at this time were C-46 aircraft up in the top right there, which basically allowed the Americans to jump an entire platoon from one aircraft. And so it was really for the first time in the war. You may remember from Operation Market Garden that delivering those divisions took multiple sorties, which again contributed to some of the problems that operation suffered from. And so the planners really had the benefit of having as many airframes as possible. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't scrambling to find every last single aircraft they could get their hands on to tow gliders and whatnot. But by and large, they had plenty of aircraft with which to deliver both of these divisions into a single drop. Now, one of the things that they did not have an abundance of were glider pilots. And so if you go to the next slide, we're gonna do a little comparison and contrast here, if you will, between the way that the British set up their glider pilot program and the way the Americans set up their glider pilot program, because I think it's an interesting thing to look at as to how vastly different they thought about it. And again, this kind of goes back to what Paul was saying at the beginning about the way the British approached using gliders and the way the Americans kind of approached gliders, in some cases, honestly, almost as an afterthought. And so the British Glider Pilot Regiment was an Army unit. And so this had, and we'll see why this is relevant here as we go through the rest of the story. But the British glider pilots were organized in squad and platoon and company size elements that mirrored the way an infantry unit was organized on the ground, right? So they were fully capable pilots. They could fly aircraft, but they also were very familiar with how to operate on the ground. Now, the challenge at this time of the war was, again, going back to Market Garden, the Glider Pilot Regiment had suffered significant casualties from Arnhem, and they only could muster a little over 650 glider pilots in the spring of 1945. Varsity plan required that they have almost 2,000 glider pilots. And so what ended up happening to make up those shortages, they started bringing in power pilots from the RAF to fill in the billets of the glider pilots. And so what that ended up meaning was that you now had Royal Air Force pilots coming into essentially an Army unit, and the commander of the glider pilot regiment was really keen. He was confident in these RAF guys' ability to fly, but he really wanted to imbue them with the culture of the regiment, right, which was very much a fighting regiment. They viewed themselves as quite capable, and I think that it's, as one of the commenters just said, it was widely, held that the glider pilots earned their red berets multiple times in ground combat and were considered to be peers of the airborne troops. Now, that is a slightly different view than was held of the American glider pilots. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit.
Very diplomatically said there, James. Yeah. I mean, it is a completely different ethos, isn't it? I mean, I remember having this conversation with people in Normandy about just the difference between glider pilots. It's not like one is right or wrong. It's like talking about the British or the American cemeteries. The Americans have one big cemetery centrally in the battlefield. The British, Canadians, we have small ones dotted around. there's not the one is better or worse. It's just different, and it clearly at the concept idea of gliders, the British and Americans diverge in what they think the units are going to be and how they think the people are going to be plucked to do this role. And it's just interesting. And of course, we should the whole concept of glider landings ends in 1945, because by the time the next war comes around, it's helicopters. So there wasn't a very long history of this type of warfare, so we only have World War II to study. And they are incredibly divergent methods of how the whole thing is viewed.
That's right. That's a great setup, Paul, because one of the things that set the American program on its path was that the glider pilots in the U.S. were in the Air Force, right? And I'm just going to use the term Air Force. It was Air Corps, then it was U.S. Army Air Force, and I'm just going to call it Air Force. They were Air Force pilots. Now, one of the challenges that the Air Force had with this was the Air Force was not a big fan of non-officer pilots, right? So now the Air Corps did start off at the beginning of the war with a handful of sergeant pilots or NCO pilots. I met a couple of them who flew missions into Sicily, but not long after Sicily, the Air Force started doing away with those positions, and they transitioned some of them into flight officers. Flight officers is ranked very similar to warrant officer. It doesn't have some of the same stringent requirements that it took to become an actual full-fledged officer. And so when the Americans started their glider pilot program, they had some big challenges to overcome, because they initially wanted their pilots to be full-fledged pilots. Well, so imagine you meet the criteria to become an Air Force pilot. Do you want to fly a fighter? Do you want to fly a bomber, a transport aircraft, or a glider with no engine? So it became this issue of they couldn't really get anybody to volunteer who was qualified to fly these other aircraft, because they all wanted to fly something that could take off and land under its own power, right? Which makes sense to me. So what you ended up with in the glider pilot program is you ended up in some cases with guys that were too old, right? So they were qualified pilots, more than capable of flying aircraft, but they didn't meet the age restrictions to be a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot. So they became glider pilots, wanting to stay close to flying, staying close to aviation as possible. You also had, depending on where you were in the pilot pipeline, if you washed out of, say, fighter pilot school or bomber school, in some cases you were given the option to volunteer to be a glider pilot, because you've gone through that far through the training. Hey, Johnny, if you want to stay, close to aviation, we have this other program over here. And so they would go become pilots for the glider program. What that meant was that the glider program was constantly undermanned as far as the numbers of glider pilots that the U.S. needed during the war. This was painfully clear during the operation in Sicily and Normandy, where the regulation was that every glider was supposed to have a pilot and a co-pilot. And in reality, in both Sicily and Normandy, the vast majority of gliders that went into those operations had a single pilot up in the cockpit. And I'm sure some of you have heard the stories about the pilot walking into the back of the glider to the troops and asking anybody if they know how to drive a bus or a car. And anybody who raised their hand was promoted to co-pilot for the mission. Well, so they wanted to change that for Operation Varsity and have more pilots, but they still had this problem of overcoming the limited numbers. And we'll talk about how they solved that problem.
And just briefly, James, what's your opinion? Because we've been left with it. You said there about, some of the pilots who became glider pilots had washed out of fighter training, which has led to this, I think, mainly false narrative that they're there for shit. I've read that in lots of books about Normandy, is the American glider pilots were shit because they were washouts. And you're going, no, it's like they try to play for the Manchester United first 11, but in the end they got a job with Arsenal. It's not, whatever, or Manchester City, I should say, to be topical. But it's not that they were crap. It's just that they weren't quite as absolutely brilliant as those that went to fighters. So I think we should address the fact that not being good enough to be a fighter pilot doesn't mean you're a bad pilot. It just means you're not good enough to be a fighter pilot, which is a very, very elite status. So I think that's something that has endured this idea. Just conversely to how there's chat in the sidebar about how revered the British glider pilot regiment is that the American glider pilot has been left with this legacy of them all being crap, which isn't the case. I would argue.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Paul. And let's pause on that for a second, because one of the things I want to make clear as we're comparing the two programs, and I am going to be critical of the U.S. program. I don't ever want to imply for 1 second that these guys lacked skill or, more importantly, bravery. It's still important to remember that being a glider pilot was voluntary.
Yeah. And
nobody could force you to become a glider pilot. And so they all wanted to fly. They all wanted to be aviators. They were in a unenviable position between the Army airborne units that didn't really want them and the Air Force units that didn't want them. And so one of the challenges, as we talked again about the British system and how it was organized essentially along a squad, platoon, company level, one of the challenges that the American glider pilots had to overcome was they never really had a home. And by that, I mean, they never really were organized along those lines. And I'll give an example of what that looked like, just using very simple terms. But when the assignments would come down to the various troop carrier squadrons for missions, and let's just say Squadron A in Sicily was going to drop paratroopers and Squadron B is going to bring in the gliders, Squadron A would transfer all of their gliders and their glider pilots to Squadron B for that to bring in the gliders, right? So then they go into Sicily. Well, then Squadron B would never transfer back the glider pilots to Squadron A. And then Normandy comes along, and Squadron C is now going to do the glider mission for Normandy. So now all those glider pilots get transferred over to Squadron C. So you had this proverbial stepchild situation going on where the glider pilots never felt like they were permanent members of a unit. The unit themselves never viewed the glider pilots as permanent members of their unit. And so therefore, they always got the worst billets. The Air Force, again, kind of tended to look down at them because the Air Force was generally all made up of power pilots who didn't take gliders very seriously. They certainly did not ever go out of their way to help the glider pilots train for their ground role. Now, all American glider pilots going through the training pipeline in the United States spent time on the rifle range, spent time learning how to use their weapons. But because of this weird situation where they're being transferred from squadron to squadron, they're pilots first, none of them really trained together as a unit. And this became extremely clear in Operation Market Garden. So if you go to the next slide, and again, we're gonna talk in some generalizations here, right? But you basically had three groups of American fighter pilots in Operation Market Garden. You had the group that decided to follow the plan, which was land their gliders in Holland and then revert to their evacuation corridors, right? The idea was that glider pilots are pilots. They're not meant either in the British system or the American system for sustained combat. Now, obviously, the British in Arnhem spent a tremendous amount of time in that battle and did a fantastic job as part of that. But by and large, I'm speaking from a what's the word I'm looking for? From a
general point.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm losing it. But anyway, basically the idea was they were supposed to leave the battlefield as soon as practicable because they were needed for potential follow-on airborne operations, right? So you had that group of the Americans who evacuated as per plan. Then you had a group of glider pilots who decided that they were going to hang out and stick around the battlefield as long as possible to fight the Germans. And then you had a third group that went AWOL and went into Brussels and spent the next several weeks drunk. And so after this operation, and you can see this quote here, and I'm not going to read it, but this quote was pulled from an after-action report written by General Gavin, who was the commander of the 82nd Airborne Division. And he kind of understood that the glider pilots were in this less than enviable situation, right? That they wanted to do all of these things that they were supposedly stood up as a unit to do. But because the Air Force was giving them flight maps instead of ground maps when they got, and they're obviously landing on the ground, because the Air Force wouldn't issue them compasses, entrenching tools, sometimes things of this nature. The glider pilots were just not really capable of executing their ground mission. And so, based on this after action review and this scathing report that Gavin filed after the mission, the American program really underwent a massive change. It didn't go so far as to model it on the British system. They still stayed in the Air Force. There was some talk of moving them into the Army, but the Army's concern was that they wouldn't be able to, they would be in a disadvantage to help them address their flying requirements, because the Army didn't actually own any aircraft at that time. So they stuck them in the Air Force. But what they ended up doing was, for Varsity, was organizing them into what they called provisional companies. And so if we go to the next slide, what this meant is that they took the glider pilots that were going to be flying into Varsity and organized them along the lines of ground units. And then they ran them through a very extensive ground training as units, right? So guys were now actually going through training in the squads and platoons that they would be expected to fight in on the ground in Germany once they land in Varsity. And so General Miley, who was the commander of the 17th Airborne Division, was interested in their success, because if he could harness a well-trained glider unit, that essentially gave him another battalion of trigger pullers on the ground. Now, again, sticking with the glider pilot mission, he was intending to assign them perimeter duty, roadblock duty, guarding POWs. But if they could execute these missions, particularly defending perimeters and things of that nature, that could free up his regular rifle companies to go do the mission that they needed, which was to actually execute and seize terrain as part of those objectives, right? And so,
and theoretically, it makes a good. It's sensible to make them feel part of the airborne ethos. You're training as a ground for a ground role, like the guys you'll be taking in by glider. You're feeling part of the team, as opposed to a kind of pilot who arrives at last minute and meets a glider full of people you don't know. I mean, that's where as a Brit, I kind of like the British system, because they felt integral to what airborne forces were about. It was the glider wings were an elite thing that Air Force pilots didn't have. They were separate, as you said there. They earned the red beret. They wore the Denison smock along with the paratroopers and the glider infantry, and they were part of that team. Whereas, so it makes immediate sense to me to make the glider pilots feel part of the same team that the guys in the back are.
Absolutely, I agree. And it was interesting. There were stories I've read about RAF pilots who were seconded to the glider pilot regiment, wearing berets with their RAF uniform and things of that nature, and the RAF chain of command getting bent out of shape about it. But you could tell they immediately gravitated towards that esprit de corps, and certainly training these glider pilots in units was an attempt to replicate that same thing. They went through a 200-hour crash course before Varsity. 75 hours of that was spent on rifle ranges, learning the familiarity between the bazookas and Thompson submachine guns, because at this time, the Americans had to do a similar thing to what the British did, which was place power pilots into those co-pilot seats so that everybody had a pilot and a co-pilot in the front of their in the cockpit of those gliders. And so what the United States had started doing stateside before sending pilots over, troop carrier pilots over, was they were dual rating all of those pilots, so that when they arrived in Europe, they were both rated to fly C-47s and C-46s and glider pilots as well. So some of these pilots arrived over in Europe and were immediately taken out of their troop transport units and put into glider units, and they participated as well in this training as well, to get them ready for their ground mission, right? So while all this is happening, of course, if you go to the next slide, the Germans were not sitting idle on the far side of the Rhine. I'm not going to go into elaborate depth on the German arrangements. As Paul mentioned, we talked a little about some of these things before, so there's more in depth on that previous episode. But it is important to bring out just a few points on this, and that was that on the immediate side of the Rhine, across from 21 Army Group, was under the command of this gentleman by the name of Alfred Schlemm. He was a German general, World War I veteran. He was also participated in the planning of the Operation in Decrete, Operation Mercury. So he had a solid understanding as to what the capabilities of airborne troops were and weren't. He knew, he took it as a matter of course that Montgomery was going to use airborne troops. There's a whole story behind that. But he also had access to a captured Market Garden after action report written by the Allies. And so he realized that the Allies were probably not going to drop their forces as far inland as they had, as aggressively as they had in Operation Market Garden. Now, one of the things that he had plenty of were anti-aircraft weapons and machine guns. And so Schlem went about the process of lacing the suspected drop zones and landing zones with anti-aircraft guns and plenty of machine guns. And so the Germans were in a pretty high state of alert and essentially were expecting Varsity when it launched on the morning of March 24th, 1945, which takes us to the next slide. And so on the morning of March 24th, the Allies launched what was the largest airborne armada assembled during the entire war. And that armada took off from airfields in England, 11 in England and 12 in France. The 17th were flying out of France, and obviously the 6th Airborne were coming out of England. That armada was made up of essentially 1,600 troop transports, a little under 1,400 gliders, 500 fighters from both the RAF and the Air Force were flying escort duty, and then bringing up the end of that formation were 240 B-24 bombers. And those bombers were they were stuffed with supplies, again, taking some of the lessons from Market Garden, and they were coming in on the tail of the airborne troops to drop those supplies, so the airborne troops didn't have to linger on the drop zones, and that they didn't have to worry about a potential lack of time between the link up with the ground forces. The armada was so large that if you had stood on the ground when the first aircraft flew over, you'd be standing there for over 3.5 hours until the final aircraft passed overhead. So I think that just kind of sets a real portrait, if you will, as to the air power that is droning its way into Germany as part of this operation. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll now kind of just have a quick refresher on the landing zones. We're going to be speaking again today predominantly of the bridges and the glider missions to seize those, starting up in the British sector there. The 1st Air Landing Brigade had divided their landing zones into company-sized landing zones. So where you see LZO, LZU, LZR, etc., there were actually even within those mini landing zones, if you will, specifically assigned to pilots to bring the infantry and all the associated elements into specific spots. And in the lead of all of that were 15 Horsa gliders dedicated to seizing bridges X, Y, and Z. And this, Paul, is where I need your French to come in, because it's called they called them the coup de main or coup de main.
Yeah.
So you have to forgive my accent. But these were forces that were specifically dedicated to come in and seize these bridges. You'll see again a slight difference of how the Americans approached it. But the first 15 gliders were dedicated to seizing these bridges and these coup de main parties.
And just a little bit about the bridges. You may be going to be saying this in a minute, James, but what's our intel like about what the Germans are likely to do with regards to these bridges? Are they likely to defend them, or are they likely to blow them to stop? Because that came up in the sidebar right at the beginning. Have the Germans got these bridges mined for demolition? So what was our intel, and did the intel differ from reality?
Yeah, so intel suggested that they were mined for demolitions, and in fact, they were. We'll talk a little bit about that. But they also suspected, and again, this was one of the reasons that Schlem had a pretty good idea as to where this airborne operation was going to take place, is because the Allies didn't bomb any of these bridges. And so, as you're doing battlefield preparation, and as Montgomery is doing extensive preparation of the battlefield, right? Preparation of the battlefield is this idea of before you commit your forces to the battlefield, what are you doing to actually influence the battlefield, right? And so what's going on at all the bridges further inland at railheads and in Vessel and everything, the Allies are bombing everything that would allow the Germans to bring forces into interfere with the eventual operation, right? But they didn't bomb any of these bridges. And so again, it doesn't take a Napoleon to figure out why the Allies might not be bombing these bridges. So Intel suggested that they were rigged for demolition, but Intel also suggested that the Germans were going to use these bridges again for their mobile reserve. And so part of the sense of urgency was getting to these bridges quickly in order to defend them and hold them against those reserves moving in. Okay, so going to the next slide. So of the 440 gliders that the British were flying in, 402 of them actually made it into Germany. 38 of them suffered tow rope malfunctions, tow rope snapping. A couple of them unfortunately disintegrated in air. There was a Hamilcar that the tank fell out of it, and maybe that was because it wasn't balanced right. So there were a number of tragedies kind of over the channel that occurred on their way in. The first horses started coming in for the Ox and Bucks. So this is the 2nd Battalion of the Ox and Bucks are coming in to seize objective Y and Z. And some of you may be familiar with the Ox and Bucks from seizing Pegasus and the Orne bridges. That was D Company. B Company, in this case, was responsible for seizing the road bridge there on the bottom left. And C Company was responsible for seizing the railroad bridge, the larger picture on the right. Now, as the first glider was coming in, it had number 17 platoon on board. And again, the horses were large enough to where you could get an entire platoon in them. Sadly, that glider was shot down 2,000 feet as it was coming in to land, with all hands on board. The pilots and all of the troopers from the Ox and Bucks were killed in that subsequent crash. But soon as the other elements landed, the engineers charged these bridges and took down the German demolitions and immediately replaced them with their own demolitions in case they needed to blow those bridges. And in fact, so these pictures were taken in 2010 when I visited the battlefield. And the road bridge is obviously a newer bridge. The rail bridge, though, was surprisingly the same bridge that was there in 1945, and you could see numerous bullet holes were in it. I have to guess those occurred during the war. I don't think there was a lot of shooting of bridges after the war, but anyway, there was a lot of bullet holes in that rail bridge. So it was by 11:40 that morning that the Ox and Bucks declared both of these objectives secure, and that they had seized both of the bridges intact. Now, one of the reasons why the road bridge has been replaced was that at sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. that morning, the Ox and Bucks did have to actually demolish that bridge. So the Germans were counterattacking into the bridgehead as suspected. There was a tank that had gotten onto that road bridge, and they were afraid that the Germans were about to break through. So somewhere in the 0 dark hours of March 25th, they blew that bridge up. They did retain and control the rail bridge. Now, a little bit further down the Issel River on our next slide, we have the 1st Battalion of the Royal Ulster Rifles seizing Objective X, and they came in literally 1 minute after the Ox and Bucks, their gliders started landing. Their first glider came in, and you can see here, looking at this main picture on the left, it landed within 150 yards of the bridge that they were supposed to seize. And again, I just think this goes back to the skills of the glider pilots, right? We're all familiar with the famous how close landing they got to Pegasus Bridge, which was a marvel of flying, especially at night. And again, you can see the glider pilots here landing pretty close on the button as far as getting their troopers as close to the bridge as possible. So they seized the bridge. You can see here some of the Royal Ulster Rifles digging in on the far side of the Issel. It was a pretty nice natural defensive area. They dug in the opposite slope to defend against German counterattacks. There were 5 self-propelled guns that started leading that counterattack. At least one of them was hit by a Piat that then motivated the rest of them to kind of turn around and retreat. This upper photo here, I wanted to include just because it shows how close the anti-aircraft gun positions were when these guys were coming in and landing on the drop zone. So those two, potentially three on the left there underneath the wing, those are all dug-in anti-aircraft positions. And then those little dart-looking dug-in positions are German trenches. And so the landing zones, as I mentioned, Schlemm was aware that this was unfolding, had fortified those landing positions, and in many cases, the glider pilots were coming in. There's stories of the co-pilot shooting out the window with Sten guns to suppress the anti-aircraft guns as they're coming in and literally screaming in and landing right next to them.
So, just worth considering, as you said there, how accurate those landings were, and the comments in the sidebar about that, because this is the perfect execution of what gliders can do, isn't it? It's the Fort Eben Emael from the Germans in 1940 in Belgium. It's the Pegasus Bridge, and here it's that you are depositing a large number of fully armed troops together in one place silently. That's the key thing about the glider can do. Because I remember having this conversation many times with people in Normandy. Why didn't we just use paratroopers? Thinking paratroopers are great, but paratroopers take a long time potentially to link up on the ground, because if there's 100 yards between each man, you have to roll the stick up. The engine noise can be heard flying over, whereas gliders come in that last several miles silently. And we all know there are examples of glide. You talked about the tragic accident of the loss of the glider earlier, but when they work well, you can do this, and that is what I think sometimes people fail to recognize, why people would entrust their lives to canvas and plywood devices, because you can do this with them.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah. So the next slide has another example of some pretty spot on flying. So this was another objective of the Royal Ulster Rifles, not a bridge, but it was the Hamilton rail station. And you can see here the gliders just on the other side of the trees, or right up tucked in against the objective they were supposed to seize. And then I imagine this is a crash glider, but the tail and the wing here of one that landed right on the money. There's a story that I wasn't able to verify on one of the bridges that the glider actually was so accurate that it landed on the bridge and had its wings sheared off as it skidded across the bridge. But I think that's a bit of an apocryphal tale. I haven't actually been able to find anything that verifies that story, but they certainly got very close, right? They got very close. Now, on the American sector, if we go to the next slide, a couple minutes after the British started landing to seize their bridge at 10:36, the American serials of gliders started coming into landing zone S. And so this was the American sector where they needed to seize these 10 bridges. And there were 8 serials going into landing zone S, which represented just under 600 gliders were going into this area. The lead serials, they didn't quite have it as organized as a coup de main party, so to speak. But the first lead serial into LZS was tasked with landing in the southeast corner so that the troopers could get out and seize bridges 1 through 4. And the second serial was landing in the east sector so that those troops could get out and seize bridges 5 through 10. Now, as the serials were coming in, the first 2 C-47s flying into LZS were shot down about a mile away from the zone. And what this meant was that the glider pilots had to cut loose a mile before they intended to, right? So you can imagine, as you're a glider pilot, your tug aircraft gets shot down. You have 2 choices. You can either cut loose early, or you can let it pull you into the ground. So this had kind of a domino effect of what was going on in the rear echelons of the Armada, right? Because these gliders started cutting loose. The planes behind them had to start slowing down or raising in elevation in order to avoid running into them. This kind of had a stair-step effect, and that you ended up with most glider pilots wanted to be cut loose around 800-900 feet. Some of them ended up being released as high as 1,600 feet, twice as high as they would have preferred. And they prefer lower altitudes because that means that they're in the air for less time, which means that they're spending less time being a target to German anti-aircraft. And so as we, there we go. So the Americans landed, and same kind of situation as in the British. They seized all 10 of their bridges intact. Now, a number of these bridges, some of these bridges were more important than other bridges just because of the class of bridge that they were and the weight that they could support, which made them more valuable for both the Germans and the Americans, because again, the idea was to push their armor over these in either direction. And so of the American bridges, bridges 5, 2, and 1 were the most contested of the bridges, especially bridges 1 and 2 down in the Vessel area, where there was a bigger percentage of Germans down there in the reserves trying to get into that bridgehead. Bridge 1 ended up having to be demolished. Bridge 5 ended up being demolished during the night as well. In the morning, in both situations, in both the British and in the American sectors, engineers went to work immediately on those bridges to reinforce them and get them ready. And we'll talk a little about how they were used in a second. But one story I did want to tell on the next slide, because this picture I'd seen many times as I was researching the operation, and the story behind it is actually pretty interesting. And so this is a sidebar to the bridges, but I wanted to tell this story. So this glider was piloted by a flight officer by the name of Bruce Merriman, and his co-pilot was a guy named John Hefner. And they were coming in, and they were on final approach, and they were about 4-5 feet off the ground when a German anti-aircraft shell exploded inside the glider right behind the cockpit. And so what this appears to be is a very devastating landing. But what happened was, when that shell went off, the American gliders, the nose came up on the American gliders, which is how they loaded and unloaded equipment. That nose flipped up after the mechanism that held it in place was shredded by the anti-aircraft shell. The guy in the back was sitting in a Jeep. So this glider was bringing in a Jeep. The Jeep shot out of the front of the nose about 3 feet above the ground with the glider infantryman inside of it. The Jeep landed on all 4 wheels. He put it in gear and drove off. Meanwhile, the 2 glider pilots stayed in their cockpit and basically landed on their back, looking up at the tail of their glider as it folded and landed in this position. They were both injured by the shrapnel that exploded, but everybody in this glider actually made it out alive in this precarious landing. And then the 2 glider pilots actually got out of here, ran over to a ditch, and were almost killed by a B-24 bomber that was shot down and crashed right opposite where they were, avoiding gunfire.
Wow.
So anyway, that's just an interesting story I wanted to share. But if we go back to the glider pilots on the next slide, go one more. Yeah, and then we'll go back to that one in a second. So we've seen the glider troopers. They exited their aircraft, rushed to their objectives, seized those. So did the glider pilots, right? So the glider pilots got organized into their ground units of squads and platoons, moved out to their objectives. Those objectives varied from setting up POW enclosures, temporary guard points, manning roadblocks. So there's kind of a famous American glider pilot story, the Battle of Burp Gun Corner, where some glider pilots held off a German attack that included a Stug. And then they also manned perimeters, right? So like I said, these tasks allowed the rifle units to go and execute their mission. So this is kind of a collection of photos that are showing the glider pilots exiting the operational area. So on the left, you've got the British glider pilots, escorting prisoners down to the shores of the Rhine River for eventual evacuation. You've got a group of Americans up here awaiting to be evacuated. And so one of the policies that the Americans put in place to encourage the American glider pilots to actually show up on time to be evacuated was they told them during their briefings that if you don't show up to your evacuation points on time, we're going to start sending telegrams to your family that you're missing in action. And so it was a way to encourage the pilots who didn't want to put their families through that anguish to expedite their evacuation. So this bottom picture was taken by a glider pilot on his landing craft as he was departing across the Rhine River. And it's kind of a cool one because a lot of the glider pilots stole German bicycles to help them get to the Rhine River. And you can kind of see the bicycles here are making their way back across the Rhine with the pilots in tow. So this is kind of a cool photo that kind of captures that moment. Now, if we go back a slide, going against the grain here was, of course, as the glider pilots are evacuating the bridgehead, Montgomery is bringing over multiple divisions across the Rhine River. Operation Plunder, initial assault wave was 5 divisions. Within the Varsity sector here, he followed that up with the 7th Armored Division and the 6th Guards Brigade, which essentially the 2 airborne divisions, the 2 airborne divisions were attached to those units, right? So again, just kind of showing you the limited lifetime that the Airborne Corps has on the ground in Operation Varsity. So Ridgway actually crossed the Rhine River amphibiously. He did not jump in. So he was the airborne units, once they started moving their phase line, the 18th Airborne Corps pretty much surrendered control of the 2 airborne divisions somewhere around the phase line London, phase line New York, where those divisions were then attached to the 2 British mechanized units that allowed them to then start pushing out to phase line Paris and beginning Montgomery's envelopment of the Ruhr. And again, that was one of the primary objectives there. And so, as we look at Varsity, I think the bridges are an important and often overlooked component of that. And it's also, when you hear critics of Varsity, one of the things they say is, well, the bridgehead wasn't extended any further in the Varsity area than it was on either of the shoulders based on the airborne troops. And again, I would argue that, and you see this in the unit diaries and in the minutes from the meetings that were going into the planning. It wasn't about extending the bridgehead. It was about seizing these bridges, right? Yeah. It was about who can get to these bridges first and who can then own those bridges for the attack out or the attack in, right? And that's really where these gliders come into play.
What you're saying is it's all about where that river was in relation to the Rhine. If it had been closer or further away, those bridges would have been important. It's just about how the geography worked, is why the bridgehead wasn't bigger.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so if we go 2 more slides up. So Eisenhower wrote after the war that Operation Varsity was the Allies' most successful airborne operation of the war. And I think, as you've seen through our conversation, that it took advantage of all of those hard lessons learned at the expense of human life, unfortunately, from those earlier operations. And, while Varsity was successful, it was also very costly. The 17th Airborne Division suffered about 1,300 casualties, 430 of which were killed in action. The British 6th Airborne Division suffered just over 1,000 casualties as well, with 347 men killed in action. And then the glider pilot regiment suffered about 38 men killed in action, with another 77 wounded in action. And the Americans, glider pilots, suffered similar numbers, with 35 killed in action and another 106 wounded in action. And so while Varsity did take advantage of these lessons, it still was very costly. And I think it goes back, it bookends nicely to the point that Paul started us off talking about, which is that the war didn't really go out with a whimper. It went out with a bang all the way up until virtually the last day. And I think Operation Varsity is very symbolic of that.
And I think we talked about this at the beginning, James, but where people, the airborne aficionados, spend, and I do include myself in this, great lengths going to all the things that went wrong with Market Garden, or all the things that went wrong with Operation Mercury, other airborne operations. We could equally do all the things that went well with this. I mean, Great Dominion mentioned earlier about the Typhoons dropping cluster bombs, anti-personnel bombs on the other side of the bridges, that the use of liberators to you talked about to bring supplies in. You could do exactly the same lists of all the things that went well, but I think that what's going against Varsity in terms of why we don't discuss it is not enough went wrong, so therefore it's not a pub conversation. I'm not, of course, I'm saying that just after you talked about the losses of this operation. So I'm in no way saying that I wanted it to go wrong. I'm just saying that historians love debating the things that didn't go perfectly, and because Varsity went pretty well, it just seems to have fallen through the cracks. And you're an ex-paratrooper. I think I asked you this in the first show, James, but whether you're a British paratrooper, a French paratrooper, American paratrooper, the stories that when you're going through training, you're talking about in the bars aren't crossing of the Rhine, are they?
No, exactly. And that's what led me to write the book, was that, when I was going through jump school, I remember seeing a list of all the American, combat jumps. And, I thought it was Sicily, France, and Holland, and so it was one of the things that led me to kind of learn more about it. But you're absolutely right. It's I think it's just kind of human nature that we are drawn to disaster to a certain extent, and that tends to be the focus of our conversation. But it is, and again, I think it's I think I can't, I'm going to get the stat wrong, but it's something like the Allies, before they landed in France, predicted the day that they wanted to be in Berlin, and they got it wrong by something like 9 days. So it's like, the mechanism that goes into things like the First Allied Airborne Army, the supreme headquarters of the planning, all of these things that, you can make the comparison that you don't see the Russians doing in the Ukraine, are all the things that, make war possible, a successful campaign happen. Right. And the Allies, sometimes don't get nearly enough credit. I think James Holland does a good job of talking about this, right? The operational level of how you move all these things around and get them in the right place at the right time to execute is not as fun as talking about the disasters.
Yeah, well, even when you were talking about the difficulty of the gliders coming in at different altitudes, you've got to fit a lot into a small area. That's a problem that the Allies have because of their strength. Is that if they were the Germans, if they were mounting an airborne operation, they'd have 3 aircraft and 12 guys and 2 machine guns. So there'd be no question of not fitting them in the sky. Because the Allies have so much stuff, just fitting them into a space is something that has to be overcome, and that is the restrictions of the resources we have. We've got the restrictions not enough. We've got so much, it's difficult to use together. That's a different kind of problem. But we'll do a couple of questions there. So the first one is from Scott Grimwood: is what approximate percentage of airborne troops were delivered by glider in Varsity?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I'm going to think out loud as I try to answer that. So there were roughly 19,000 armed men going into Varsity. You had 2 parachute regiments in the American Army. You had 1 regiment, 2 regiments of the British Army. So you're looking at, I would say it was probably 60-40.
Yeah. That's what my math was telling me something.
I owe you a better answer than that. I'm sorry. I should have those numbers handy, but I'm guessing.
Okay. The next one is the glider pilot casualties is going to be split between battle in wounds and bad landings. Is the question from Reverend Howell there.
I think actually, and I didn't see the injured numbers. So typically a bad landing, if it wasn't induced by the enemy, it's considered an injury as opposed to a wound. And so I suspect that the wounded numbers we've seen are actually suffered by enemy action as opposed to an injury, which would be what would happen if you were in a bad landing.
Okay, and the other one I think you kind of half references is what is there to see from World War II, from Varsity around Vessel today? I mean, are there, obviously you went to the bridges there, and there are obviously the odd monument here and there, but is it a kind of a rich environment for the battlefield enthusiasts to go there and match up locations and find things?
I would say yes and no. I mean, it's the landscape. I mean, Vessel itself has grown in size, and so some of the immediacy of the things around Vessel aren't the same, but the surrounding area around that is very much the same. So it's still very much agricultural areas. I mean, I was able to find without difficulty the Burp Gun Corner battle that I mentioned. You can still, you can find period pictures and go do a comparison contrast of that. Hammonklin, very much, the city center of Hammonklin is very much the same as it was. You can see pictures of, like those glider pilots marching the POWs out of there. There's a handful of monuments. As a matter of fact, tomorrow they're unveiling a monument to the 17th Airborne Division outside of Hotel House Duden, which, if I hope I said that right, is where one of their objectives was. It was at the time of Varsity, it was a German regimental headquarters for an artillery unit. So you have to really look for it there. There's not nearly as many signs as saying this happened here. But one of the rewarding things that came out of writing this book was I was actually in communication with a Belgian who's used the maps that I put in my book extensively to go research some of these areas, and has done some archaeological work, find some of the battle sites, which has been interesting. Because the way I did the maps in the book was I actually used the grid coordinates from period after action reports and put them on period maps, and then created the maps based on that. So the maps are pretty accurate. So you could use those if you're interested in touring the battlefield. And a lot of the, Deersfort Forest Castle, which was one of the 507th objectives, is still very much the same as it was in March 1945. But you definitely got to work for it.
But then that makes it more rewarding, doesn't it? And and I've seen it recently. There's the author of the book, The Rifle, is over in I think he's in Germany now with a few veterans, and I've seen some 17th Airborne interest in the last few days on Facebook and social media. So it's good. I mean, we as we know, there's only so many 101st monuments you can fit into the Bastogne perimeter before they end up being more monuments than turrets. I'm not saying that in a negative way. I love going to Bastogne. I love seeing what there is there. But the fact is, there is still room for acknowledgement of what the 17th Airborne did, and indeed the British 6th Airborne there. And it's nice to think that people gradually can shift their interest across to this operation, because it was hugely successful and it was a completely airborne operation. That's we have had that on several World War II TV shows, and people are quoting, even people like General Kinnard, that the 101st in as well as they did in Bastogne, it wasn't an airborne operation. They were brought in by truck. I mean, it's still fantastic, but this is an airborne operation. This is an all arms coming from the sky, and I don't just mean paratroopers and gliders. I mean talking about the 24s and the Typhoons and Spitfires and Mustangs, the supplies coming in. It's using intelligence. It's using our superiority in all arenas. It's using the ground element well. It's a really good, interesting battle to study, and it's exactly what the airborne ethos is about. So more for Varsity, I say. I hope more people are prompted to go and do some specific books on this, because as I said at the beginning, my Varsity book collection is pitifully small.
There's so many stories out there to tell, so many stories to tell. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, it's been absolutely great talking to James. I'll just remind people what we were coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, we continue with our airborne theme tomorrow. Tomorrow, I suspect, will be an interesting show and a very popular one, because we have return guests again. Eric Dorr from the Gettysburg Museum of History and Jared Frederick are on to talk about their forthcoming book on Ronald Spears, the infamous legendary soldier in E Company 506, commandant at Spandau Prison, the career, you name it, he did it. And I'm sure people will be lining up to ask those two authors some of the questions about some of the legendary actions that Mr. Spears is involved in. Of course, the real thing will be to go out there and buy the book. So if you're going to buy a couple of books today on Amazon, you might as well buy two at the same time. So if you haven't already, don't forget to go and get 4 Hours of Fury, and also put an order in for this book about Spears, because it will answer, because I've read it, some of those questions you have about Spears. And that will be tomorrow, same time, 7 p.m. GMT, and then lots more shows coming your way next week. So again, reminding you, like the shows, click subscribe, consider becoming a patron, consider becoming a YouTube member. Views have dropped a little bit with what's going on in Ukraine, understandably. So those of you are still, getting something out of listening to us talking about a war when we're in the middle of one. Well done for sticking with our channel. And as you know, I've had some qualms about whether or not I even should be continuing programming when there's actually a war going on, but I have considered it, and I'm going to carry on doing broadcasts. So thanks for your commitment, thanks for your support. But right now, I'm going to bring James back in just to say goodbye, really. But before I do that, what's next for you? Any more books on the horizon? Any more research work?
Yeah, actually, I'm in the process of finishing up my next book now, which is about the 11th Airborne Division in the Pacific Theater. So, pretty interesting story there.
Well, I will book you straight away to come a launch party for your book on that, because I like talking about the Pacific, I like talking about the airborne, and I like talking to you. So that's win, win, win. So just let me know when you want to come on, and we'll do that. So brilliant.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to give a quick thanks to everybody who joined us today. I appreciate you joining and appreciate your questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, well, that's it. We'll leave it there. So this is Paul Woodadge and James for World War II TV saying I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for your time. Bye.